It all began on a quiet Saturday morning in the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Brookside Meadows. The air was fresh, the lawns were trimmed, and the world seemed content, except for one person, Karen Wallace, the self-proclaimed neighborhood watchdog. To most, she was just a nosy neighbor, but to those unlucky enough to live within shouting distance of her perfectly pruned hedges, she was a menace wrapped in pearls and passive-aggressive emails. My life in Brookside had been simple. After years of city noise and apartment living, I'd finally bought a small but comfortable home with a decent-sized driveway. The house wasn't fancy, but it had everything I needed, including space for my pride and joy, a forest green pickup truck. It wasn't new, but it was strong, reliable, and spotless, the kind of vehicle that had seen miles of hard work and held stories in every scratch. The first few months in the neighborhood were peaceful. The truck sat in my driveway every night, gleaming under the streetlights, and no one seemed to care. That was until Karen noticed it. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch her standing by her mailbox, arms crossed, glaring at my truck as though it were some sort of criminal parked in plain sight. Then came the muttering, little comments tossed into the wind about property values and unsightly work vehicles. I ignored it. After all, every neighborhood had one like her, someone who needed to control everything within a 5-house radius to feel important. But Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the unofficial enforcer of the OA's unwritten rules that went far beyond the actual bylaws. And she wasn't the type to let something she didn't like slide. One morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice stuck to my windshield. It was handwritten, not official, but the message was clear. This vehicle violates community standards. Move it immediately. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable, neat, sharp, and aggressively polite. Karen had declared war. I shrugged it off at first. My truck was parked legally, well within my driveway, and the HOA bylaws allowed personal vehicles as long as they weren't commercial or inoperable. Mine was neither. It was in perfect condition. But ignoring Karen only made her bolder. A few days later, I noticed her taking pictures, not discreetly, but right out in the open. She'd stand across the street, phone in hand, snapping shot after shot of my driveway like she was documenting a crime scene. Sometimes she'd even bring a tape measure, pacing around the sidewalk as if calculating the distance between my bumper and the curb. It would have been funny if it weren't so intrusive. Word spread quickly. Neighbors started whispering. Some rolled their eyes, others avoided the drama altogether. But I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen escalated. She always did. Sure enough, one evening, as I returned from work, I noticed a group of HOA board members standing near her driveway. They were talking in hushed tones, with Karen at the center, gesturing animatedly toward my house. I didn't need to hear the words to know what she was saying. She was lobbying for action, claiming my truck was a nuisance or an eyesore. By the following week, I received an official letter from the HOA. It was polite but firm. They had received multiple complaints about a non-conforming vehicle being parked in view of the street. They requested that I relocate it to preserve the visual harmony of the neighborhood. That was the breaking point. The request wasn't just absurd, it was personal. Karen had taken something I loved, something harmless, and turned it into a weapon against me. She wanted to prove she could control what I did on my own property. She wanted submission, not compliance. But she wasn't going to get it. Instead of fighting back immediately, I decided to play the long game. I started documenting everything. Every photo she took, every letter she sent, every time she crossed the line from nosy to invasive. I reviewed the HOA bylaws meticulously, highlighting every section that proved my truck was fully compliant. I even went to the county clerk's office to verify that my property lines and parking setup were entirely legal. Then, I made sure to keep the truck in perfect condition. Every weekend, I washed it until it gleamed like new, polishing the chrome until it mirrored the sunlight. It wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a statement. That's when things took a darker turn. One night, just after midnight, I heard the rumble of an engine outside. When I looked through the blinds, my heart sank. A tow truck idled at the edge of my driveway, its amber lights flashing faintly in the darkness. The driver looked uncertain, glancing between a clipboard and my truck. Standing next to him, arms folded and smirking like she'd won the lottery, was Karen. She had actually called a tow company. But something was off. The driver hesitated, checking his notes again, then pointing toward the street. Karen gestured toward my driveway, clearly trying to convince him otherwise. After a tense minute, the truck's engine revved, and it pulled away. The tow driver wasn't about to touch private property without authorization. I watched from the window as Karen stood there, frozen, her victory slipping away before her eyes. Then, without another word, she stomped back toward her house. That night, I realized something important. Karen didn't just want the truck gone, she wanted control. But control could be broken, and I was just getting started. From that moment forward, I began crafting a plan. One that wouldn't just stop her harassment, but would expose how far she was willing to go. A plan that would turn her obsession against her. And remind her, when you pick a fight with someone who plays by the rules, you'd better be prepared for when they know them better than you do. Because in Brookside Meadows, appearances were everything. And soon, Karen's spotless reputation was about to crack. The morning after the tow truck incident, Brookside Meadows buzzed quietly with curiosity. Word had traveled fast. Faster than the HOA's weekly newsletters ever could. Neighbors whispered about Karen's midnight stunt. Some with amusement, others with concern. Few had the courage to confront her, but everyone knew something had shifted. The woman who'd once ruled the street with passive-aggressive authority had been publicly embarrassed. And by her own doing. From my window, I could see her pacing near her mailbox that morning, arms crossed, lips pursed in that familiar expression of indignation. Her defeat hadn't stopped her. If anything, it had fueled her determination. I knew then that this wasn't over. Not even close. So, I began to prepare. I started keeping a meticulous record, not just of Karen's actions, but of everything. Dates, times, letters, even the angle of her camera when she, coincidentally, walked by snapping photos. I installed a discreet security camera above my garage, its lens aimed perfectly at the driveway and street beyond. Not to spy, but to protect myself from whatever came next. And as it turned out, that was a wise move. Within a week, another letter arrived from the HOA. This one was sterner, filled with bureaucratic phrasing about community compliance and aesthetic standards. It warned that further violations could result in fines or even towing, an eerie echo of Karen's failed attempt. But this time, the letter wasn't anonymous. It was signed by Gregory Shaw, the HOA president. A mild-mannered man with a reputation for fairness, Shaw was known for trying to keep peace between residents. That was how I knew, instantly, that Karen had gotten to him. Behind the HOA's letterhead, I could see her fingerprints all over it. The phrasing, the urgency, the veiled hostility, all unmistakably hers. But here's where she made her mistake. The letter referenced a bylaw section that didn't actually exist. It cited Article 9, Section C, Prohibited Vehicle Visibility. When I flipped through the official HOA handbook, there was no such section. The closest clause dealt with commercial vehicles and boats, not personal cars or trucks. That was the leverage I needed. I took photos of the letter, highlighted the fabricated section, and drafted a formal response addressed to the HOA board. I was polite, factual, and thorough. I attached photographs of my property, the truck, and the exact bylaw text proving compliance. I even copied the local county ordinance confirming my right to park any legally registered vehicle in my driveway. Then I delivered the packet in person. Not to Karen, but to Shaw himself. He looked startled when I handed him the envelope, but he promised to review it. I could tell he wasn't a bad guy, just easily influenced. The kind of man who preferred peace at any cost, even if it meant letting someone like Karen dictate the rules. Days passed. The air between my house and hers grew thick with tension. Every time I started my truck, I could see her curtains twitch. Every time I stepped outside, her eyes followed. It was almost comical, like living next to a surveillance camera with a superiority complex. But then, something new happened. One afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, a stranger approached me. A delivery driver holding a clipboard. He looked confused. Apparently, someone had reported my truck to the city's code enforcement office for illegal commercial parking. Of course, it was Karen. She'd gone beyond the HOA now, escalating her campaign to an official level. Luckily, the officer assigned to investigate quickly realized there was no violation. The truck had no company logos, no ladders, no equipment, just a regular vehicle parked on private property. Still, it was enough to trigger an inspection notice, which meant another round of documentation and visits. That was when I decided it was time to stop reacting and start acting. I filed a formal complaint against Karen for harassment and false reporting. I included timestamps, photos, and the video footage of her interactions with the tow truck. The city official took it seriously. He mentioned that repeat false complaints could be treated as misuse of public resources, a fact I knew Karen would hate. But I didn't stop there. I sent another packet, this time to the HOA board, with a full breakdown of events, including Karen's fabricated citations, her interference with a private towing company, and the repeated harassment attempts. I requested that her behavior be formally reviewed under the HOA's own conduct policy, which prohibited harassment or interference with the peaceful enjoyment of other residents. It was a quiet, calculated move, one that left her with no visible enemy to lash out at. All she could do was wait while her reputation unraveled in the hands of the very organization she'd weaponized. Meanwhile, I kept things normal. I washed my truck every Sunday, waved at passing neighbors, and maintained my lawn to perfection. If she wanted to paint me as a rebel or troublemaker, she'd find no evidence of it. But Karen didn't know how to stop. Late one night, I noticed her outside again, walking her small dog. Only this time, she wasn't walking. She was peering under my truck with a flashlight. She was searching for something, maybe a way to justify her next complaint. I stayed silent, watching from the shadows of my porch. The security camera caught every second. The next morning, I emailed the footage directly to the HOA board with a calm but firm note. This is becoming a safety concern. The response came quicker than I expected. The board thanked me for the submission and assured me the matter would be reviewed at the next HOA meeting. For the first time, the balance was shifting. The same organization Karen had used for years to control others was finally starting to question her. As I sat on my porch that evening, the sunset washing the sky in orange and pink, I realized something satisfying. She had made this personal, but I had made it documented. And in any battle between emotion and evidence, evidence always wins. Still, I knew her kind. Karen wasn't one to go down quietly. The more cornered she felt, the more desperate she'd become. And if my instincts were right, her next move wouldn't just be about the truck anymore. It would be about me. The HOA meeting came and went, but the tension didn't fade. If anything, it thickened. A quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface of Brookside Meadows. The board had reviewed my evidence, acknowledged the validity of my complaints, and assured me that further action would be discussed privately. But I didn't need a transcript to know what happened next. Karen wasn't the type to accept being questioned. When people like her lose control, they don't apologize. They retaliate. It started subtly. Little inconveniences that could almost be dismissed as coincidences. My garbage cans mysteriously rolled into the street overnight. My mailbox flag bent backward one morning. A smear of what looked like mud appeared on my truck door, even though I hadn't driven in days. I recognized the pattern. It was too deliberate to be random, too targeted to be harmless. The real escalation, though, came with the violation notices. 3 of them, all within 1 week. The first claimed that my lawn ornaments violated community aesthetic standards. That was laughable, since I only had a single stone bird bath. The second accused me of who properly stored waste bins, though I'd taken photos of them neatly aligned beside the house. The third was the most absurd and alleged noise disturbance at 2 a.m., apparently from revving engines. I knew who filed them. Everyone did. But Karen never signed her name. She didn't need to. The HOA system allowed anonymous submissions, and she exploited that like a weapon. Still, I had something she didn't: proof. Every one of her claims was contradicted by my timestamp security footage, so I compiled another file. Date, time, footage, and a concise summary of each false report. I didn't send it to the OA this time. Instead, I sent it to every board member individually. A quiet reminder that the community's trust in their leadership was being tested by one person's obsession. By the end of that week, 2 board members reached out privately, thanking me for handling things professionally. I could sense their frustration with Karen growing. Her vendetta had started making them look bad. But Karen didn't back down. When she couldn't win through the HOA, she turned to social manipulation, the subtle art of gossip warfare. Suddenly, small groups of neighbors began giving me sidelong glances. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Someone whispered that I was causing problems with the board. Another hinted that I was one of those anti-HOA troublemakers. Karen was working overtime, planting seeds of mistrust everywhere she could. And yet, she didn't realize that in her effort to destroy my reputation, she was building her own downfall brick by brick. One afternoon, I caught a glimpse of her standing with another neighbor near the community park. She gestured dramatically toward my house, shaking her head as if recounting some tragic scandal. I couldn't hear what she said, but the expression on the neighbor's face, skeptical, uncertain, told me enough. Her credibility was slipping. Still, I didn't confront her. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I knew she thrived on conflict. So I did the opposite. I smiled, waved at neighbors, kept my property pristine, and acted as though nothing she did could rattle me. But I was documenting everything. Every petty act, every late-night trespass, every whisper of defamation. Because I knew the right time was coming. The moment when her actions would finally cross the line into undeniable evidence of harassment. That moment arrived one humid Thursday night. It was just past midnight when I heard a faint scraping sound near the driveway. At first, I thought it was wind or a stray branch. But when I checked my security app, the live feed showed something shocking. Karen crouched beside my truck, holding a small utility knife. She wasn't slashing tires, not yet, but she was scraping something into the dirt near my tires, muttering under her breath. Then she did something unexpected. She placed a folded piece of paper under my windshield wiper and hurried back toward her house. The next morning, I retrieved it. The note was written in neat, angry handwriting, a printed AO logo at the top, clearly copied from old letters. It accused me of continued noncompliance, warning that disciplinary measures would soon follow. She'd forged it. That was it, the line she couldn't uncross. Within hours, I sent an email to the entire HOA board with the footage, the forged letter, and a detailed timeline of events. I sicked a local attorney whose name carried weight in property law. The reaction was swift. The HOA board called an emergency session. Karen wasn't just in trouble. She was exposed. The board had no choice but to launch a formal inquiry, and since forgery was a potential legal issue, they referred the matter to local authorities. For the first time since moving into Brookside Meadows, I felt the weight on my shoulders lift. The nightmare she'd created was finally unraveling, not because I fought louder, but because I fought smarter. But peace didn't come immediately. In fact, as the investigation started, Karen grew erratic. Her front lights stayed on all night, her blinds constantly twitching. She stopped walking her dog, stopped talking to most neighbors, and her once perfect yard started showing neglect. The queen of control was losing her kingdom. And yet, I didn't celebrate. Because deep down, I sensed she wasn't finished. The board might have turned against her, but people like Karen didn't surrender. They imploded. The OA's next meeting would determine her fate. Whether she'd be fined, suspended, or even removed from her position as head of the compliance committee. Until then, I stayed quiet, calm, and prepared. Because I knew the storm's eye wasn't calm by nature. It was calm before something worse. And sure enough, when the HOA meeting finally came, Karen didn't walk in with shame or apology. She walked in with evidence of her own, something she believed would destroy me. The community center was packed that night. Word had spread quickly that the HOA meeting wasn't going to be routine, not after what had happened. Even residents who usually couldn't care less about board politics showed up, drawn by curiosity and quiet anticipation. The tension was thick, almost electric. People whispered in small groups, eyes darting between Karen's empty chair and mine. Then she walked in. Karen looked different. Her usual confidence had cracks running through it. The stiff posture, the forced smile, the papers clutched too tightly in her manicured hand. Yet, she was determined. You could see it in her eyes, the defiance of someone who refused to believe they'd lost control. When the meeting began, the board chair recapped the investigation briefly. The facts were simple: forged HOA letterhead, falsified violation notices, and security footage showing Karen trespassing on private property. There was no denying it. The board members' expressions told the whole story. Disappointment, embarrassment, and quiet anger. But Karen wasn't about to surrender quietly. When she was given the floor, she stood tall and began reading from her stack of papers. Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed. She claimed everything had been a misunderstanding, that she'd only left the note to remind a neighbor of community standards. Then she flipped the narrative completely, accusing me of harassment. That's when she brought out her so-called evidence. She handed out printed photos, grainy, nighttime shots of someone's silhouette standing near her mailbox. Then she presented an email allegedly sent from my address, filled with threatening insults. Finally, she pulled out a written statement, supposedly from another neighbor, claiming they'd seen me, following Karen around the neighborhood. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Some residents exchanged uneasy glances. Others just looked confused. I didn't flinch, because I knew what she was doing, trying to confuse the narrative, to make herself the victim and me the aggressor. It was a tactic I'd seen before. When cornered by truth, people like her try to drag everyone into the mud with them. But her evidence was fragile, built on desperation, not facts. The board reviewed each piece carefully. The photos were inconclusive. The figure could have been anyone. The email looked suspicious. The timestamp didn't match, and the formatting didn't match my writing style. As for the neighbor's statement, the signature was shaky, almost unrecognizable. Then came the part she hadn't planned for, the digital forensics. One of the board members, a tech consultant, had already verified the metadata of her forged letter and cross, referenced it with the HOA printer logs. The system showed Karen's login ID as the one that generated the fraudulent notice. And the so-called threatening email, it came from a free disposable address, one created less than an hour before it was sent. Karen's plan collapsed right there in front of everyone. The murmurs turned into gasps, then silence. You could almost hear her heartbeat pounding against the walls. The board chair cleared his throat and declared that the evidence presented by Karen was not only false but deliberately falsified, a clear violation of the HOA's ethical conduct and possibly local law. For the first time, Karen had no words. Her composure cracked entirely. The carefully constructed image of authority she'd spent years building crumbled in seconds. She tried to protest, to shift blame, but no one believed her anymore. It was over. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position effective immediately. They would also be referring the case to law enforcement for review, particularly concerning the forged documentation and trespassing. Karen's seat was empty before the meeting even ended. She walked out silent, her papers crumpled in her hand, her face pale as frost. The room buzzed with relief and disbelief. Some neighbors came up to me afterward, apologizing for ever doubting me. Others just nodded, acknowledging the quiet justice that had finally unfolded. But even as the board assured me that the matter was resolved, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. People like Karen don't just vanish. They simmer. They wait. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood seemed to calm down. The HOA meetings grew civil again. My mailbox stayed untouched, my truck unbothered. For a while, it felt like peace had returned. But then small things started happening again. Not like before, not blatant acts of harassment, but eerie little signs that someone was still watching. Once, a plastic bag appeared on my porch filled with shredded paper and a single wilted flower. Another time, my security camera caught a shadow lingering at the edge of my yard late at night, motionless for several seconds before disappearing. I couldn't prove it was Karen, but I didn't need to. I recognized the signature of spite when I saw it. Then came the letter, not from the HOA this time, from Karen herself. It was hand-delivered, slipped under my front door one evening. The handwriting was shaky, angry, but coherent enough to make her intentions clear. She accused me of ruining her life, claiming she'd lost her position, her reputation, even her friends. She said I'd humiliated her, and that I'd regret it. There was no threat of violence, but the implication was heavy. It was the last desperate gasp of someone whose entire identity had collapsed. I kept the letter, sealed it in a folder with everything else, and handed it to the board and local authorities. They advised me to stay alert, but assured me Karen had no legal grounds to contact me again. Still, I knew better than to underestimate her. She was humiliated, cornered, and stripped of the one thing she cared about, control. That combination made her unpredictable, and when the next HOA election rolled around, something strange happened. A new candidate emerged, one who used suspiciously familiar phrasing in their campaign emails. The name was different, but the tone was all Karen. Months passed, and for a while, the neighborhood returned to its carefully maintained calm. The lawns were trimmed, the sidewalks swept, and the once divisive HOA meetings felt routine again. The chaos Karen had left behind had faded into something almost forgettable, like a bad storm that had finally blown over. But beneath that calm, something was shifting. It began subtly, the way trouble often does. The HOA's newsletter started including new proposals. Small amendments about community aesthetics, parking guidelines, and property appearances. Nothing outrageous at first, but the tone was eerily familiar. The words carried a certain sharpness and undercurrent of control disguised as neighborhood pride. Then came the email. It was sent from a new address belonging to a woman named Kara Benson. Recently moved into a nearby house that had sat empty for years. She'd volunteered to help the HOA with communication and community harmony. Most neighbors didn't think twice about it, but I did. The phrasing, the tone, even the formatting of the email felt like déjà vu. Kara was Karen. There was no doubt in my mind. The board, however, couldn't act without proof. Karen had technically moved out of the neighborhood after losing her position. If she'd found a way to return under a different name or through someone else, she was skirting the rules cleverly enough to stay undetected. But I'd dealt with her before. I knew her patterns. Her obsession with control, her fixation on appearance, and most of all, her inability to let go of a grudge. The first sign of her renewed influence came when several neighbors received new friendly notices, reminding them about mailbox color consistency. Then, a proposal surfaced suggesting new HOA bylaws restricting personal vehicle display, a rule that would, of course, target my truck. I could almost picture her smirk as she typed those words. Still, this time I wasn't reacting emotionally. I'd learned my lesson. Instead of fighting back immediately, I began documenting everything again. Every email, every notice, every oddly familiar turn of phrase, all saved. I also started quietly gathering allies in the community. Because while Karen may have been good at manipulation, she had burned too many bridges before. The people she had once intimidated were now watchful, skeptical, and tired of being controlled. Then one evening, while reviewing old board archives, I found my breakthrough. Buried in the HOA's digital correspondence logs was a metadata trail. The same IP address that had once belonged to Karen's old account was showing activity linked to Kara's email. It was subtle, hidden beneath several forwarding servers, but not enough to hide completely. The board had been duped. She'd never truly left. She had just changed masks. I scheduled a private meeting with the board president and presented everything. The metadata evidence, the repeated phrasing patterns, even screenshots of identical writing quirks between old HOA notices and Kara's new ones. The president's face turned pale as he reviewed the data. They called an emergency meeting that week. The truth came out, slowly but undeniably. Karen had returned under an alias, using a friend's property deed to justify her residency. She had been sending emails, influencing policy suggestions, and even funneling communication through a proxy on the board. Someone she had manipulated into thinking she was just helping out. It was a web of deceit, carefully crafted, but it unraveled fast once exposed to the light. The board voted to permanently ban her from any related position or advisory role. They also revoked the proxy members' privileges for violating transparency rules. The atmosphere in the meeting was a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. How could someone go to such lengths just to control a few neighbors? But that was Karen's curse. She needed to be in charge, even if it destroyed her. I thought that would finally be the end of her. And for a while, it seemed that way. Weeks went by, and the emails stopped. The rules eased up. The air in the community felt lighter. I even started focusing on rebuilding my backyard. The space where I'd once parked my truck was now a little project zone, filled with plants, solar lights, and small woodwork projects. But peace doesn't last long when obsession is still lurking nearby. One afternoon, I came home to find a large envelope taped to my garage door. Inside was a printed photograph of my truck parked on the street, circled in red marker, with the words, "It doesn't belong here anymore," scribbled underneath. No name, no signature, just those words. I immediately checked my security cameras, but whoever left it was careful. The footage only caught the tail lights of a silver sedan pulling away. It wasn't fear I felt, it was exhaustion mixed with certainty. She wasn't done. That same night, several other neighbors reported similar anonymous notes about rule enforcement, property standards, and visual clutter. It was like she was trying to reassert her power, even from outside the system she'd been expelled from. But she underestimated one thing: the community had changed. This time, the residents banded together. They shared the notes, cross-referenced them, and found identical handwriting and phrasing patterns linking them all to Karen's past notices. It wasn't just my battle anymore. It was everyone's. A group of neighbors organized a collective response. They filed an official complaint with the city, attaching all the evidence we'd gathered, including security footage, handwriting comparisons, and the digital metadata from before. The city's Community Enforcement Division got involved, and a restraining order was soon issued preventing Karen from contacting or approaching anyone in the neighborhood again. That was the breaking point. She'd pushed too far, and the law finally stepped in where the HOA couldn't. The morning after the restraining order was filed, a police cruiser was parked down the street. Officers visited Karen's supposed new residence, which, it turned out, wasn't hers at all. She'd been renting a room temporarily just to stay close enough to monitor the neighborhood. By noon, she was gone. Moved out overnight, leaving behind an empty mailbox in a community that collectively exhaled for the first time in years. It felt surreal. For so long, Karen had been the invisible force behind every conflict, every unnecessary notice, every stressful OA meeting. And just like that, she was gone. The neighborhood felt alive again. Kids played outside, neighbors smiled, and the board even voted to revise several outdated rules, including the one about vehicle parking that had started the entire feud. Still, even with the peace restored, a part of me stayed alert. Because with Karen, you never really knew if it was truly over, and I was about to find out just how far her obsession had really gone. For months after Karen's forced departure, the neighborhood entered a golden stretch of quiet normalcy. The lawns were greener, the board meetings shorter, and the tone of community emails had softened into something almost cheerful. People began to trust again, to believe the era of constant conflict had finally ended. But deep down, I wasn't convinced, because people like Karen don't simply move on. They retreat, they replan, and then they return, sharper and more vindictive than before. I'd seen it in her eyes at that last meeting, the look of someone who'd lost control and couldn't accept it. The first sign came one late autumn morning. A realtor's sign appeared at the corner house, just 2 lots down from mine, the one that had been empty since the last owners moved out. Within days, the sign changed from "for sale" to "sold." A week later, a moving truck arrived. I watched from my porch as a new tenant stepped out. A woman in her late 40s, wearing oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low. She moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, and disappeared inside without a word. At first glance, it didn't raise alarms. People move in and out all the time. But when I saw the car parked out front, a silver sedan, the same model and color as the one that had left notes on my door months earlier, my stomach tightened. Karen was back. Only this time, she wasn't pretending to be on the board or sending notices. She was staying hidden, silent, patient, biding her time. Over the next few weeks, small, unnerving things began to happen again. The floodlight in my driveway was unscrewed one night. My trash cans were moved halfway down the block. A thin scratch appeared along the side of my truck. Little things, not serious enough to call the police over, but enough to feel her presence again. I started keeping logs. Dates, times, everything. I even upgraded my cameras, adding motion alerts and night vision. Every time the system pinged, I'd check. But whoever it was, they were careful, always staying just out of frame. Then, one night in late November, I caught her. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Around 20:14 a.m., a figure in a hoodie approached my driveway, crouched near the mailbox, and slipped something inside. When I checked the next morning, I found a sealed envelope. Plain white, no return address. Inside was a photo of my house, taken from across the street, with a single sentence written in thick black marker. "You took my life. Now I'll take yours apart." That was the final line she crossed. I immediately called the police and handed over everything, the letter, the footage, the full documentation from months of harassment. Because this time I wasn't just defending myself from HOA politics. This was personal. The investigation moved fast. Officers visited the new house down the street, but once again, she was gone. The car was still parked there, but the inside of the home was empty, as if she'd packed up in the middle of the night and vanished. Later, I learned she hadn't even bought the property. She'd been living there illegally, squatting while using fake rental agreements to keep the listing off official records. It was all part of her attempt to stay close without being found. When law enforcement finally traced her down, she was staying 2 towns over, living under a false name. They confronted her, and though she avoided criminal charges for trespassing due to technicalities, The restraining order was extended for 5 more years. The police assured me she wouldn't be coming back, and this time I believed them. The following spring marked a turning point. The community, now entirely free of Karen's influence, decided to celebrate, not with an official event, but through small acts of restoration. Neighbors repainted mailboxes, hosted cookouts, and planted flowers where bare patches had once been. It was symbolic, a way to reclaim the space that had once been overshadowed by control and fear. For me, the closure came one morning in May when I finally took down the old camera facing the street. I didn't need it anymore. The world outside my home finally felt like mine again. Still, as I stood in the yard, I couldn't help but think about the way it all began. One woman's obsession with control spiraling into years of chaos, all over something as simple as a parking space and a truck. Karen's downfall wasn't dramatic. There were no arrests, no shouting matches, no grand finale. Her end came quietly, through isolation, exposure, and the realization that her power meant nothing once the people she tried to control stopped fearing her. And that, I realized, was the real revenge. Not the reports or the restraining orders or even the digital proof that brought her down, but the silence that followed her departure. The peace she could never achieve, the calm she spent years destroying in others. That was her punishment. In the end, the HOA became what it was always supposed to be. A place where people looked out for each other, not spied on one another. Meetings became friendly, rules were simplified, and neighbors found laughter where tension once lived. As for me, I left the truck parked right where it always had been. It became a quiet symbol of standing your ground, of refusing to be bullied, and of outsmarting the people who mistake intimidation for authority. Every now and then, I still catch myself looking down the street, half expecting to see that silver sedan again. But it never comes. Karen's story was over, and mine finally began again in peace.